Please give them a huge, warm welcome. Come on up, guys. Thanks, Ben. Appreciate it. Reid, always a pleasure. Have fun, you guys.
All right. Well, good morning. Good morning. Hello, creativeLIVE. Well, we're delighted to be here, and we're going to spend about an hour going through some of the key concepts of the Startup of You, our book on career strategy that came out about a year ago. And what we're going to do is I'm going to start by describing how Reid and I got inspired to do this book, what was happening in the world that caused us to want to develop a new way of thinking about career strategy. And then we'll walk through some of the key concepts from the Startup of You.
So thank you for coming today, and thank you for listening on the internet. The key thing that we are trying to do is figure out how to help folks with an understanding of how the new world of work works. And part of I've had this idea for some time because a lot of the kind of career strategies are roughly dependent, and we're going to go into this a bit on the kind of the career ladder or career escalator, but that mode has changed. And the question is how to help people understand this, how to help people understand what is the way to think about how to work, how to attack a career. We started thinking about this purely as initially a college thing, and then we realized that it actually applies to everyone. Yep. And I've actually even had folks of mine who are partners at my firm at Greylock and other places say, oh, actually, I was reading your book, and actually page 45 was really useful to me. So we hope this is useful to all of you as well.
Indeed. Okay, so the genesis of the book. So, for the last 40 to 50 years, the way careers have worked in America has functioned kind of like a escalator, right? The job market's been defined like a well-oiled escalator. For many generations in America, folks would go to college, get a college degree, be among the rare elite that would obtain a college degree, and upon graduation, pick from one of a handful of predefined career tracks. So you'd kind of pick finance or manufacturing or technology, and then you'd work hard to land an entry-level job at a Goldman Sachs or a GE or a GM or an IBM. And upon landing this entry-level job, the way it worked is if you worked hard and weren't particularly unlucky, you would kind of get whisked up the organizational hierarchy, right? You land an entry-level job at an IBM, you work hard, you put in your dues, and slowly but surely you accumulate increased levels of seniority and experience. And over the course of your career, you may change jobs a few times, you may change companies a few times, but you're going to stay in that very stable career track until you, and kind of ride this escalator up, until you reach the top of the escalator and step off into a government-financed social security system or company-financed pension system. And that's the way it's worked for a very long time. And the natural gravity of that escalator has really been the underpinnings of the American dream, which is that every generation of Americans enjoys a higher standard of living than the ones their parents had. That's been true for many generations, but for the first time ever, or the first time in many years in America, young people today, people in their 20s on average, will not enjoy a higher standard of living than the one their parents had. And that's because this career escalator, which has guided the way we think about careers for so long, is now jammed at every level. So people coming out of college today can't find jobs, right? Youth unemployment in America today is at its highest level since World War II. People in the middle of their career, in the middle of that escalator, are finding themselves stuck in promotionless limbo. Americans today are registering their lowest levels of career satisfaction since the data first started getting recorded. And then people at the top of the escalator, people in their 50s and 60s who historically have been, preparing beach plans and ready to retire, in record numbers are having to rejoin the workforce and reinvent themselves and acquire new skills in order to remain competitive. And they find their company pension exploded or the government social security net no longer reliable. And so this jamming of the career escalator has forced us to all reconsider a lot of basic assumptions about how the world of work works, about the economy, about the labor market. And the causes of this jamming have to do with technology and globalization to create a world for all of us which increasingly resembles the Silicon Valley ecosystem.
And part of the thing when you look at the kind of career escalator as a model, a lot of our strategies, a lot of how we think about even, kind of in the last couple of decades about how you manage your career continues to be this, well, like, for example, discover your passions when you're, when you go to college, like, no, the job will work out. You just need to figure out what it is you're particularly passionate about because there'll be jobs for everything. There's a question of, in terms of how the career escalator has gotten jammed, is when you say we now have longer lifespans and industries are changing in ways that are much faster. That says, all right, well, what happens when I get to 60 and actually I haven't actually fully and I need more economics? How do I make that happen? And because the career escalator is jamming, it's changing the compact between essentially companies and employees. And it used to be that the employees didn't have to think about how to invest in themselves. They would basically just kind of go, okay, I'm here. There's a pattern that's run by this company, and then of course it morphed to, okay, it's not just one company, it's several, but it's still a career path by which I'd be trained to do things. I'd be sent out on a management class or on a training in this technology class. But what has changed is that since the industries are changing in a way that's no longer capable, is that no longer functional, is that people have to learn how to invest in themselves. They have to learn how to essentially drive how it is that my value as a worker, as an employee, the way that I drive my career is much more like a business than as an employee in terms of how I think about it. Now, you may do you may still spend your entire career at one company, but in doing that, you are still thinking about yourself as a business as you go through it. And so part of what we had realized, and this is part of why Ben and I came together to do this book, was that we felt that people didn't have the mindsets and the skills that were appropriate to this new world, because the mindsets and skills are essentially an entrepreneur's mindsets and skills, and that there was nothing that kind of that kind of made that easily accessible to people who weren't already deeply embedded in entrepreneurial communities. And so what we did is we sat down, we talked about it, and we said, well, let's take the advice that we give entrepreneurs for their startups, and let's then compact it for what is good for individuals. There's a bunch of things like, for example, how you raise venture finance or other kinds of things which aren't appropriate to individuals. But there's a bunch of things about how you direct essentially an entrepreneurial company that's the same way that you direct your own work life, your own business life. And that we then said, all right, well, the book is an attempt to distill those key concepts, those key mindsets, and those kind of techniques for how to be entrepreneurial in your work life. You might start a company, that's great, the advice should work for that. You might never start a company. The advice is still useful in terms of how you proceed. And so part of the way that we think is very urgent is how you understand we should move to the new world of work, is that industries are changing at faster and faster rates. So there's this, John Seely Brown and John Hagel have this expression called the topple rate, which is the rate at which companies drop out of the S&P 500. That's doubled in the last 2 decades. In terms of the speed at which this is a simple measure of industry transformation. You can just look at a whole wide variety of industries in terms of how the modern kind of technological acceleration, which globalization is part of, is transforming like what is viable industry in any particular region of the world. You can look at newspapers, you can look at automobiles, you can look at a large number of industries, and that transformation is happening. And so part of how the career escalator got jammed is that businesses could no longer say, well, I have a 50-year, 40-year stable path that just works this way, because the businesses themselves are changing, and they need to adapt.
And those changes are trickled down to the level of the individual.
Yes.
That's, I think, a key point that we're making, is that these tectonic changes of globalization and technology are changing all these industries and all these companies, and now that's affecting every individual and every individual's career journey, and forcing every individual to be more entrepreneurial and to learn from Silicon Valley and how Silicon Valley entrepreneurs build amazing companies in conditions of uncertainty and change, and apply those strategies to their very life, their very career. We'll show a quick video that explains a bit more about the idea.
What happened? Were companies supposed to guarantee jobs for life? Was the government supposed to rescue everyone? Were universities supposed to grant degrees that promised unlimited opportunity? The world has changed. There's plenty of blame to go around, but the solution is within you. All humans were born entrepreneurs. In the caves, we were all self-employed, finding food, feeding ourselves. That's how human history began. And that's the entrepreneurial spirit we must rediscover. We have it within ourselves to take control of our career and build the future we want. And we do this by looking at the lessons of today's entrepreneurs and applying them to our lives. How we adapt, how we develop a competitive edge, how we take smart risks, how we use our networks. You see, today's challenges actually present enormous opportunity. You were made to survive almost anything. You can invent yourself and invent the future. The startup is you.
Gotta love the hand raising.
Yes, exactly.
Get goosebumps every time. All right, so that's the backdrop for why we're here. That's the problem that we're presenting and the problem that we want to talk about how to solve. And for the balance of our talk, we're going to get into a few specific strategies for what each of us in the room and on the internet can do to take control of our career and accelerate our career today. So we're going to go through a series of ideas, look at what entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley do to build amazing companies, and then map the idea, map the advice to an individual career context. So the first idea we're going to talk about is competition. Do you want to kick this off, Reid?
Yeah. So one of the things that's kind of the mistake from the old, how the world has changed, is you now no longer just think, oh, I discovered my own passions, I sit in a room and I meditate about what I'm good at and I just go do that. You have to think about that you are there along with thousands of other people, right? And so for interesting jobs, there's always competition. There's a question of how you get product market fit relative to that competition. And so you have to think about what is your competitive edge. And the only way you can really figure out competitive edge is when you're thinking about the market and industry around you. You're thinking about what the competitors look like in terms of how you essentially kind of say, well, how am I best at that? How am I good at that? Now, there's a lot of ways. Frequently, competition, like saying, well, okay, how am I the Olympic athlete? How am I the gold medalist at this? Is actually not what is generally required. That's in a few individuals or a few companies' perspectives. Frequently, competition is local. It's the question of, well, of the folks that this business needs to hire, or in providing this service as a small business, what does my competitive set look like? And then how do I have a competitive differentiation against that set?
And what was your differentiation, Reid, starting LinkedIn? Because entrepreneurs are the best in the world, I think, at thinking about how do you do something cheaper, faster, better than other people. What was the theory when you were starting LinkedIn in terms of the competitive landscape and how you assess that?
Well, there was a couple things. So one is, and actually, by the way, more than one, always useful. But the first was in 2002, when I left PayPal. I was originally thinking I was going to spend a year taking a vacation. Still would like to do that at some point. And what I realized is that the Valley had decided that the consumer internet was over. It was now focused on clean tech. It was focused on enterprise software, and that all of the interesting consumer internet plays had been played. And I realized that actually, one, that wasn't the case. And so I knew that in starting a consumer internet business back then, in doing that, I would be doing that when there wasn't a lot of competition. I would have the headway to start to get out ahead, to start running before other industries, other entrepreneurs realized the consumer internet was back on and started running along the same path. The second thing is I realized that there was going to be this revolution in in networks and networking. I had invested in Friendster, and I'd seen what was happening with kind of social networking. MySpace came along, Facebook. And I was like, well, actually, I think that's all awesome. I want to invest in those companies, and I think those entrepreneurs are very strong, but I also want to create a professional network. And because I thought that the context of how we navigate our work life and how we navigate our personal life are actually very different, and that could be an area where you also get differentiation because I specialize specifically in the world of work. And with that, I kind of then said, and then there's a whole set of competitive differentiation down the chain, because when we started it, there were other companies that had said, well, yes, professional networks are relevant, but they're relevant for companies, they're not relevant for individuals, so they were all enterprise sales. And these were all essentially a set of choices to hone it so that I essentially I chose a valuable space, and then I focused on it in a way that I could develop competitive advantages that people didn't know. And there's one actually other thing I would say on this, is that frequently, as part of investing or being an entrepreneur for a high impact, high scale business, what you're being is contrarian and right in terms of how you do this. So for example, when I went around with LinkedIn, one of the reasons people thought, because usually at the very early stages of company, people think, okay, like if everyone had that idea, then there'd be tons of competition, and even if you're very good, it'd be very difficult to get through the press and actually break out into something new. One of the things that made everyone skeptical about LinkedIn in the very beginning was they said, well, a network product, it's really not valuable when one person's in it. It's not valuable when two people in it. They know each other, et cetera. So you have to get to, when our back of the envelope was 500,000 to 1 million people in order to make LinkedIn, begin having the value propositions that we now have today. And the thing that I knew, contrarian and right, that other people didn't, is I knew that people back in 2003 would be curious enough to explore and say, hey, there's a new site. I know it doesn't really have a value proposition to me for right now, but I'll play with it and I'll see what it is. And that I could get to that first 1 million people entirely on that basis. And that was another place of competitive differentiation, because I made both an insight that could happen, and also took the risk and the gamble for that. And we'll talk more about risk later.
Yeah, and so what I love about that story is it wasn't you locked yourself in your bedroom, closed your eyes, and thought deeply about what a killer business idea could be.
Yes.
It was assessing all these other companies, thinking about the differences that exist. So there's certainly a focus on the market realities. Yep. But you kind of quickly said the word PayPal and consumer internet. But I think by starting LinkedIn, you're also playing to some existing assets that you were building up as well, right?
Yeah, so because part of how you should think about, we outline this in the book, is that there's essentially assets, market realities, and aspirations. Aspirations is goals in terms of where you want to go. Market realities is the shape of the industry, competition, the availability of where you can go, and the assets are how you get there. And part of, like for example, one piece that Ben's reminding me of is, well, having made some money at PayPal, even though the 2002, 2003 financing market was very difficult for consumer internet companies, I could essentially fund LinkedIn for the first year myself. That gave me a competitive differentiation asset. But the more important assets aren't the hard assets, money, that sort of thing. Those are great, and you actually absolutely need those in certain kinds of contexts. But the soft assets of the networks of who you're connected to, what your skill set is, what you know. And so, for example, by having done PayPal, I understood virality. I also happen to have a broad network of folks who understood how to build consumer internet businesses. I also had a sense of kind of what was going on generally in the industry and how to call, who to call in order to solve which kinds of problems. And one of the things that's really important when you think about kind of your competitive edge is both are what are your assets now, but also how do you evolve those assets? And usually the assets that you should be most investing in are your soft assets, which is a combination of people and skills, because those things actually persist and help you get directed and targeted. Because you say, okay, well, what is for example, if you're doing an entrepreneur like I was doing with LinkedIn, what's the key problem to solve? Because usually in a startup there are the metaphor I use for startups is you throw yourself off a cliff and you assemble an airplane on the way down. Basically means you're in a mortal situation and there's lots of fires burning. You have to focus on solving a couple of them. Well, your network, your soft assets, helps you with that, because you get this kind of collective intelligence about what are the key problems, which ones can you ignore, that's really important, and then how do you invest in them?
I want to amplify one thing that Reid was saying. So there's the PayPal assets that were being built in the consumer web that you could apply to LinkedIn. There are the market realities. You had an aspiration to build a consumer internet professional network. One of the interesting things is we map this to career strategy, because again, we're talking about competition because our thesis is that every individual needs to have a sense of what their competitive edge is in the labor market. What do you do different or better than the person sitting next to you? It doesn't mean you're better in an objective whole sense, but in a specific professional sense, how are you differentiated in the market? And entrepreneurs do this brilliantly by thinking about their existing assets, their aspirations, and the market realities around them. one of the things we learned when doing the startup review and thinking about career strategy is there are actually there are 3 really common pieces of advice that people get when they ask the question, what should I do with my life? Which is another way of thinking about the competitive advantage question. What should I be doing? What's my edge? There are a set of folks that say, play to your strengths. Right? This is a common piece of advice that's come out in the last few years for people. Marcus Buckingham and others say, think about your strengths and play to your strengths, right? Play to your assets. Then there are a set of people, again, a very new piece of advice, which is follow your passion, which in the last few years has become very popular advice, very, very new phenomenon in the self-help genre. But follow your aspirations. Think about what your passion is and go do that. And then there's a third piece of common wisdom, which is kind of what I call the tiger, or a lot of people call the tiger mom approach, which is, I don't care what you think you're good at or what your passion is, go figure out where the market realities are, where the market needs are, and go do that. Right, so for example, in America today, there's a nursing shortage. And so that the tiger mom advice is, hey, go become a nurse, right? Go get a nursing degree because that's where all the demand is in the market. And so what's troublesome about this evolution of career advice is that thinking about any one of those in isolation is wildly insufficient, right? If you only think about your assets, if you had only thought about the PayPal assets that were being developed, that's fine. But what if there's actually not a market need for what those assets translate into? Or if you only think about your passion, what if you can't monetize that passion very well? Or what if you're not very good at that passion? And if you only think about the market reality, sure, there's a market need, but what if you're not very good at fulfilling that need? And if you don't really like it, you're not going to be able to do it for very long. Or well. And so the thing we try to do in the startup review is you actually need to think about all 3 of those things. When asking the question, what kind of business should I start? Or what should I do with my life as the entrepreneur of my own life, the CEO of my career? Think about all 3 of those things and the intersection of your assets, aspirations, and market realities.
Yeah. And putting those 3 things together are critical because it's a question of you do want to play to your strengths. So that, by the way, those things are right, to understand them, how to amplify them, develop them, and so forth, because that's where you can possibly get a competitive edge. But if you don't, if you just say the strengths, like for example, I remember talking to one of my family members. He's like, "Well, I like playing video games, so I'm going to go become a video game, designer." And you're like, "Okay, that, that's insufficient. You have to think about like, how is it that you can actually do that much better? What's the market demand for that as a function? And then you want to integrate those. You might be passionate about it, but you want to integrate all of those into a coherent plan. And the plan doesn't just start with, like one of the mistakes that people make, and we'll get, actually I don't know if planning, well, I guess is an optional section here. Yeah. But one of the things is don't think about when you're doing the planning, don't just think about like, okay, here's a 40-year plan. You do an intense plan for a couple of years with a thought about where that's all going, but you have to reevaluate it as you go. And you reevaluate this combination of, kind of like your passions can change, hopefully your strengths, your assets are increasing, and the market realities are for sure changing. So you have to have a cycle in terms of how you're thinking about this and revisiting it. And one of the mistakes I frequently feel that when people are doing this, they're trying to make, well, I'll make this decision once and this is going to be for my rest of my life. And you're like, no. Make an effective decision right now, execute on it for a couple of years, and be paying attention to it as you go.
So one of the things that I think is interesting is you created LinkedIn to connect people globally and digitally. But you guys have both, in this just sort of recent intro, talked a lot about the physical, like being able to pick up a phone and call someone. And to me, that transcends the digital part. How important for you guys is the startup of you as it relates to like a personal network of people you can call, of mentors, of people you have like boots on the ground relationships with?
Real relationships with people who are your allies is essential.
Got it.
We do have a question here in the audience. If you want to stand up, that would be awesome.
Hey, Jonathan Howard. I'm starting a medical travel company, or helping people do medical travel without the risk. So if the intersection is strengths, passion, and demand, I think strengths and passion are something you can look inward and sort of figure out or ask your friends. But it seems like you guys have figured out some good ways to do the market research side, and I think that's something people have less access to. Can you talk a little bit more about how you approach that?
I'll let Reid answer, but you also said you're doing a startup without the risk. of medical travel. We'll come
Medical
back to
travel with lower risk.
Lowering the risk for the customers.
lowering the risk.
Yeah.
Okay, I thought I
Yes.
heard without risk,
Yeah,
which
yeah,
is going to be a
yeah.
segue to a later
risk.
concept we'll address.
Plenty of risk on my end.
Risk never goes to zero, actually. Well, the key thing, and some of this will be, we're going to do networks in the next section, but usually the best form of doing this sort of thing is to go find, like for example, when I started LinkedIn, I basically went to every smart person I knew and I talked to them about it. Because one of the things you learn is you get their perspective. And frequently, 2/3 of what's said they don't really understand as well as you do and so forth, and you have to kind of sort through it. But you're looking for, you go, no, not that one, not that one. But you're looking for key insights. You take it very seriously, everything that the smart people you know are telling you. And by the way, they also then introduce you to other people. So it's not just 1 degree, it's 2 degrees, and you're saying, who else should I talk to? Again, gets the network. That process, if you're genuinely open-minded, and you have to be, one of the phrases I use for entrepreneurship is flexible persistence, which is you both have a vision and a mission, and you have a conviction, and you're going, you persist. You're also flexible about it, which is you're really thinking about, well, is there really customer demand? What does the competition look like? Is there really a coherent product here? And you have to keep that agility between them as you're talking to people, because frequently I find as entrepreneurs go, no, I know, I have this idea, and yeah, I know you guys don't get it, and I'm just going to prove it to you, in which case you can frequently drive off a cliff, not be hearing the signals from talking to people the way that you should be. On the other hand, it shouldn't be like, all right, you gave that idea, I should just change what I am, because you have this vision of this thing other people don't see. But it's primarily, I find, talking to people as a function.
It's not Google searching
Yes.
to do market research from the market reality. So that can be helpful, I guess, to an extent, right? How many nursing positions are open, that kind of thing. But the critical intelligence that informs the most important career decisions almost always come from tapping someone else's brain.
And it's a combination of people who have expertise there and people who have remote expertise, not necessarily directly, because that'll give you some breadth. And all of it, every individual perspective can be wrong, but it's your job as the entrepreneur to integrate it.
And actually, one more riff on this, because we're kind of talking about network intelligence. I think there are 3 kinds of people you talk to for advice on career or life decisions. One are people that are domain experts in the area, so travel, health, whatever, they're experts in that area. Then there are people who know you personally really well. So for example, there's a domain expert, then there's your mom, and then there are just generally really smart, insightful people that may not be an expert in the domain, may not know you well, but could have a perspective to add. And the order in which you probe your network for advice could be as follows. First, talk to domain experts to get a sense of options. Should I go become a nurse? Okay, what's it like to be a nurse? What does that day-to-day look like? Okay, should I go to Nevada because there's an unusual shortage in Nevada, that kind of thing. Talk to experts. And then go talk to people you know who know you really well. Hey mom, here are my 3 options. Which option do you think is best for me? Right? That requires actually more personal knowledge of who you are as opposed to necessarily the market landscape. And then cross-check your decision with a super smart outsider. So there can actually be a system, and this is I think what entrepreneurs do extremely well and why we highlight them in the book is it's not kind of random, hey, you're a guy off the street, what do you think about the LinkedIn idea? There's actually a process through which you go through to collect really valuable network intelligence.
Yeah. Speaking of network intelligence.
Speaking of networks, let's talk about networks.
So basically one of the things is, part of the idea behind LinkedIn is we all live in a networked world, whether or not we fully recognize it or not. And most people don't realize how deep that is as a function. So for example, when you think about living in a networked world, you think about such concepts of how am I going to be found by the right people and the right opportunities. Not just how am I going to go find people, but how is it possible for other people to find me? Now, most people kind of say, well, who would ever be looking for me? And it's like, well, actually, people out there looking to solve problems. I mean, it could just even be hiring people, but looking for, co-founders for a startup, looking for finance, looking for advice, all these sorts of things. This is critical when you think about a networked world. Is not just you as an agent, but also you participating in a network where there's a bunch of people around you who are all acting, who are all looking for things, who are looking for people. And what's more, part of what that happens is as we help each other, right, we can help each other find the exact right, like if you find the right piece of insight on starting a business or the right piece of insight on becoming a nurse, that can change the curve of your business or of your career in terms of how you operate. And so networks are critical amplifiers. Now, the key question is to think, well, how should you think about building your own network? How do people build networks well and so forth? And this is actually the thickest section of the book, because most people kind of don't, they on one hand they go, well, if someone says, oh, if someone introduces themselves to you and says, I'm a networker, you kind of go, okay, great. Take a step back, right? Because it sounds like, well, I want you to be part of my Rolodex, and you could be an asset to me, and that's what your value is to me. And it's like, well, okay, that's not a good relationship. A good relationship is where we are allies, we are colleagues, we are tackling the world together. And so part of what we try to do is say, look, it's critical to think about being in networks, building networks, growing networks, but you can do it in a very human way.
And this is indeed a really entrepreneurial idea. There's a misconception, I think, that entrepreneurs are these solo heroes, right? We glorify Steve Jobs and Jeff Bezos and these guys as individuals, and forget that if they're talented at one thing, it's assembling incredible teams around them. And that's why, again, this is a core idea of the Startup Review. It's let's look at how Silicon Valley entrepreneurs build networks and learn from how they do that, because they truly are world class. And Reid, our networks are complex. There's so many different types of relationships. In the book, we zoom in on two specific kinds of relationships, allies and acquaintances. And you tell a story of your relationship with Mark Pincus. Do you want to talk about that alliance and how that's evolved over your career?
Sure, and actually it's just one of many examples. The part of what's very helpful is when you identify the folks that you're essentially going through, kind of going through your life with, and are your allies in professional context, you should actually have kind of explicit conversations about how you help each other. And part of what Mark and I met when he was thinking about doing a business, and I was at PayPal, and the business was related to it, so a VC introduced us. And we started chatting, and we realized, hey, actually, we look at some aspects of how the internet's changing, and creative and interesting ideas. Let's start getting to know each other. And we started getting to know each other, and we realized that there was a bunch of things we could do to actually help each other, and then become good friends as part of that. And it's such, for example, we both ended up investing in Friendster together because we both recognized this whole transformation of the internet going to a kind of a social platform and transferring. We said, oh, that's right, and we should figure out how to pick investments together. We should identify what the key trends are and inform our companies. So, for example, I founded LinkedIn, he founded Tribe. He was much more focused on social, I was focused on professional, but we would talk about, like, here are the things that we're encountering and here's what we're doing. And that actually made us learn faster and made us direct companies in much better ways as how it happens. And so the key thing is that these kinds of alliances it's one of the places where 1 + 1 is actually greater than 2 in terms of being able to add a huge amount of value to how you both navigate in terms of solving problems, recruiting talent, et cetera. Now, one of the things I think is important when you think about these kinds of alliances is that it's a very good thing to be somewhat explicit about them. So, for example, with Mark and I, we said, look, here, it was like, we're going to help each other because we're friends, but here's a bunch of things that we're going to actually specifically do in order to help each other. And it isn't a trading compact. It's an expression of alliance. It's an expression of, we can make big things happen in the world. Here's how we can work together. And so I think that's probably the allies.
Mark ultimately founded Zynga.
Yes, right.
And you joined the board.
And invested and joined the board, which all only happened because we were allies together.
Yeah. And it's such a powerful, the story of collaboration is so powerful. And I think, if you ask a lot of really successful professionals, no matter their industry or career, they usually identify a handful of these close allies, right? These professional allies that are emotionally rich, that have a long history, they're collaborative, they help each other over a period of many years. One of the interesting things about the topic of networks is a lot of people think social networking and the internet has changed everything as it relates to relationships. And I think actually the internet hasn't fundamentally changed the alliance dynamic. Alliance allies require a lot of time, a lot of emotional investment. You can't have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of allies, right? You can only have a handful, people like Mark in your career, and they don't happen automatically. They don't happen naturally necessarily. You actually have to work at it. So that's one kind of relationship we highlight in the book and how to go about building those alliances, and that's small in number. But then there's another type of relationship that you can actually, of the sort that you can maintain dozens, hundreds, even thousands of connections. And this is an area where I think the internet and social networking has dramatically changed the game in terms of how many people you can know, how you stay in touch with them, and so on. And these are acquaintances. These are people with whom you are friendly, but not necessarily full-on friends. These are people who you meet at conferences, who you meet at an event, at an education event, who you trade business cards with, who you see once a year, who you talk to every so often, who you connect with on LinkedIn and see an occasional status update from, and maybe like or comment on that update. And I think every amazing professional has a small collection of allies, but also a large swath of acquaintances, people who span industries, span geographies, and they have both. I think the thing that's important to remember is that it's not one or the other. It's actually having both close emotional allies and professional allies matters, and a large swath of acquaintances matter. And the reason is that people who we're close to, like Reid and Mark are very similar in many ways. People who we're close to tend to resemble us, right? They tend to work in the same industry. They tend to think in similar ways. That's why we get along, right? There's no more misleading faux truism, I think, in relationship literature than opposites attract. Opposites do not really attract. We're attracted to people who think like us and affirm a lot of our intuitions. So those are our close friends. But our acquaintances often look and feel very different, right? They may work in different industries. They may live in different places. And because they are different from us, they actually are sources of new and different sorts of information, right? So people who are close to us tend to be reading the same kinds of books, tend to know the same kinds of people, tend to be going to the same kinds of restaurants, meeting the same kinds of companies. But people who are more distant from us, physically, emotionally, intellectually, tend to run in different social circles, tend to be reading different things, tend to be exposed to different sorts of information, and therefore can be really valuable sources of information when making those career decisions, as we talked about, or trying to learn about a new trend or learn about what's going on in a different geography. So having both close allies and a network of acquaintances is really important. And one other thing, we mentioned this in the book, and I found it such a fascinating study. There's a sociologist at Northwestern who went and studied Broadway musicals and tried to understand what it was about the social networks of Broadway productions that made a production successful. So he looked at, Mamma Mia and West Side Story and these other groups and a bunch of failures, and tried to understand what it was about the social networks of the cast and crew that made one production successful and one not successful. And what he discovered was that the productions that failed, the social networks looked one of two ways. Either the cast and crew all knew each other from prior performances or productions, right? So they're all kind of close allies. There's a lot of coherence, but there's no fresh blood, no new ideas, no diversity of opinion. That failed. Another example of failure was a production in which the cast and crew had never worked with each other. No one knew anybody. On the first day, everyone was introducing themselves for the first time. Lots of diversity, lots of fresh ideas from people who were thinking differently, but no trust, right? No alliance bond. Whereas when he studied the productions that were really successful, he noticed it was a blend. Some of the cast and crew knew each other. There were some alliances. There were also a lot of acquaintances, people who hadn't worked with each other. And that blend of close ties and weak ties was really, really valuable to produce a show that had a coherent trust dynamic, but also plenty of informational diversity.
And three quick additions to that before we get to the questions
Yeah.
for the network side. One is startups in the Valley work very similar. So that pattern, we had the data from the Broadway thing, but actually the very similar thing works for startups here. The second thing is that it really is about, this is an answer to Chase's question, it really is an answer to, look, it's people you meet and actually, like acquaintances are rarely we were in a chat room together, right, as function. It's like, for example, like, you have a lot of colleagues when you work at a company. Some of them you're pretty close to. A lot of them you're fairly friendly with. Those ones you're fairly friendly with can be lifetime great acquaintances as you move on in your career. There are people who have helped me and other people that I've helped where, for example, one guy who I worked with at Apple, I literally have not seen him since 1996. I actually helped him get a job about 4 years ago, right, on a referral based through LinkedIn as a function, and that was because like, oh, actually, I know the guy. He's really good. He's dedicated, smart, you know, and that can be useful information as part of how this plays. And so it's not like, oh, do all your acquaintances online, as much as the online helps you amplify the acquaintances that you have in the life around you and helps you stay connected with them, share information, perspective, be helpful, these sorts of things. And then the last part of it is to be thoughtful and systemic about how it is you're building these alliances and acquaintances. And that doesn't mean manipulative. This back to the very first thing. That just means the ways that you, like for example, when you're thinking about how you help other people, that helps build the relationships. And so one of the things that I frequently talk about is kind of this, what I call the theory of small gifts, which is actually giving little gifts to the people around you where it's something you can do easily that's very valuable to them is a very good way of building relationships.
There's one last thing we want to talk about, because we've talked about the importance of investing in alliances, having alliances in your network, and having acquaintances, that mix. But I wanted to take a quick show of hands. Who here has been told that networking and thinking about networks is really, really important in their career? So I think we all have. Everyone's hand in the room went up. Everyone's virtual hand went up, I'm sure, on the internet. There's no topic that's more talked about in the annals of career literature. And one of the things that fascinates both Reid and me is the gap between knowing and doing, right? I can't tell you how many people I've met on this topic that nod their heads vigorously on this when hearing about, yeah, you gotta build my alliances, gotta build my acquaintances, but then don't actually take action to pursue what they know they ought to do. And in the process of working on the book, we came upon someone who had a fascinating solution to this gap. He had heard and read through his whole career, I gotta build networks, gotta be networking, but had never quite prioritized it in the way he thought he ought to. And so he came up with an idea that he called the Interesting People Fund. And he employed what psychologists call pre-commitment strategy in order to do the thing he knew he ought to do. So he was a student here at Stanford in the Bay Area, studying computer science in college, and knew that eventually he wanted to start a tech company in Silicon Valley. And while he was a student, he built up a really excellent network in the tech industry. He had a couple of allies, he had met a variety of acquaintances, but he had also spent his whole life in the Bay Area. And before settling down and beginning the long journey to build a new business, he wanted to get away and experience a different geography for a bit before kind of settling back into the Bay Area. And so he took a job at Microsoft and moved to Seattle to work at Microsoft. But as he was preparing to move, he was worried that this network that he had built up in the Bay Area was going to atrophy if he spent time in Seattle for a few years. And so by the time he would come back to try to start the business in the Valley, everyone he knew would have moved on or he wouldn't know very well anymore. And so at first he thought he would just move to Seattle and try to come back regularly and reconnect with people in his network, because that was really important. But then as he thought about it, he realized that that wouldn't happen. He knew himself that he would talk a big game about how important it would be to maintain the network, but it wouldn't actually happen. And so he took the money that he was going to save in state income tax by moving to Washington State from California, which he's asked us not to disclose because you could reverse engineer his salary, but I'll pick a number, $4,000 of income tax savings. It was ballpark in a few $1,000s. Took that money and put it into what he called an Interesting People Fund, which was pre-allocated on January 1st through the rest of the calendar year to take interesting people out to coffee or lunch. Not just anywhere, people in Silicon Valley. So a couple weeks after moving to Seattle and working for Microsoft, one of his old Stanford professors called him, unaware that he had moved to Seattle, and said, hey, Steve, I'm having some people over for dinner tomorrow night, some really interesting people. A professor friend of mine's in from out of town. Do you want to come over and join us? And Steve said, absolutely, I'm there. Booked the flight on Southwest, flew down, showed up at the professor's house with his suitcase in tow. And what's so brilliant, I think, about that example that he told us was if he hadn't had that fund set up, what would have happened? gone on Southwest, $400, hotel. Is it really worth it? I have to take a day off from work. Whatever, I'll do it later. I'll see him on my next trip. And of course, the next trip never happens. So by pre-allocating time, energy, and especially money to invest in his network, he was able to maintain these connections. He ultimately moved back to Silicon Valley recently and co-founded a company with one of the women who he met on an interesting People Fund visit to the Bay Area. All right, should we take some questions from the internet or from our illustrious audience?
Fabulous story. I love it. I love it. We have a lot of questions coming in. I want to check in the studio
Yeah,
first.
we've got one at the back row there, Ken. Let's go to the back row. Make sure you've got a mic and let us know who you are.
I'm Carlo from dogbff.com. We're doing, well, the business model is sell and dot for dog lovers, but the biggest thing we're trying to solve is how to get people together in real life, right? And I think having a dog is a strong bond that you could have with somebody. Have you looked into, what other factors come into creating a stronger bond with people like with strangers, basically?
Well, in online dating, Match.com asserts, and if this is a direct quote from them, "Do you laugh at the same shit?" is the best proxy for compatibility. So sense of humor, more common.
Show up with a bunch of jokes.
But I think in terms of interpersonal rapport, I actually think that matters hugely in terms of building a connection. I assume that was your question, right? What are the factors that build interpersonal bridges? Is that
right? Or well, basically, we're trying to figure out a third dimension, right? Like, so the given is that people have dogs and they have that in common. What we're finding is that we have people who bring in another dimension have a stronger bond. So like, I started a small group called People in Tech with Small White Dogs because I saw these. I went to this tech party and everybody had a white dog, and all of a sudden we have parties and we go to bars and people who don't.
Isn't that
necessarily know each
racist
other.
to discriminate on the color?
We also have the other group that isn't just the opposite. People in government jobs with big black dogs. I don't know, but we basically we're trying to find how many dimensions do you need to actually be able to connect with somebody more than just superficially. Have you? I'm sure you've read more into that.
Look, the deepest way is the quick one is humor. That's actually a very good test. The deepest thing is where you actually discover bonds that really matter to you. So people tend to be like local communities. They tend to be folks that you you either work with or live with, these sorts of things. And so it's how do you build that sense of relationship, and it's the depth of we are in this together. And there's a whole set of different variables to get there, but that's essentially what you riff on.
And as you've said, Reid, in other philosophical discussions you've had, we're in this together implies an opposite, implies an enemy of sorts, an opposition. Like if I were doing a dog thing, I'd rally everyone around. Who are the people that are trying to block our dog parks, right? Who are they? Let's hold rallies. Let's have meetings to talk about how bad those people are, right? Again, on those types of things that the in-group and out-group.
Don't overuse that, but yes.
Do you have a question from?
We have so many questions coming in from the internet, and there's a theme about how to get and reach people like the two of you, so that you don't even have a connection. And I wonder if you could both of one tell us a story about somebody who was successful getting through via networking to one of you who seemingly might not have a lot of time to be in that scenario.
Well, for me, it's fairly straightforward, and it's difficult with one of the things when you become better known and involved with these companies and all the rest. It is 99.9% a referral from someone I know or trust,
Okay.
right? And the reason is because essentially every meeting, every single hour that's on my calendar has at least 10 things competing for that slot. And so I literally just can't make a decision without that kind of reference when it's a new person. Sometimes you can do you meet someone at a dinner party or something else, and then that happens. But that's typical, and it doesn't have to use LinkedIn for it. Now, sometimes what happens is, for example, an entrepreneur will write to me and say, "Look, I have this interesting business," and we'll look at them and go, "Okay, that's interesting." And then I will refer it to someone else who works at Greylock to go and talk with them. And if that really works out, then I get involved as a function. And so there are some other patterns for that, but it all, for me, ultimately comes down to reference.
So it comes down to reference. I think the other key thing is try to help the person. We didn't cover this explicitly in our content. Help.
It's in the book.
It's in the book, in the presentation rather, sorry. Help the other person. Now, it's interesting when interacting with people who you perceive as more powerful than you, or more successful, or more famous, or more wealthy, whatever it is, people often just check out of the help task. They say, look, there's no way I could possibly help Reid, right? And so I'm not even gonna try, right? Instead, I'll just ask, right? And that's a huge mistake.
Exactly.
You can always find a way to help someone. And if someone's richer, more famous, more powerful, there's still one constant area where you can always add value, which is information. And we're living in an information age, a network age. People always are hungry for the latest, greatest information, new information, an article they haven't read that's relevant to one of their interests. So always, when you do the outreach, even if you have something on your agenda, find a way to help. And if the person's much higher status, it's usually give them information they haven't heard before. Again, there's so many misconceptions about entrepreneurship. We talked about on the competition slide, we said a lot of people think entrepreneurs are these geniuses who are born and have some amazing change the world idea while sitting in a dark room quietly, when in fact they're eager to collect market intelligence and talk to folks. We talked about networks and how there's a misconception that entrepreneurs do it all by themselves, when in fact they're amazing at building teams and networks, and so must we all in our professional life. And then finally, there's a misconception, I think, that entrepreneurs are these crazy risk takers who are betting the farm on their business ideas. And so it may seem odd to talk about risk in the context of what we can all learn from entrepreneurs. But in fact, the greatest entrepreneurs are not wild-ass risk takers. They're prudent risk takers. Rarely. Some are, and sometimes it works out. Oftentimes it doesn't, I'd argue. But so there is something systematic we can learn about how entrepreneurs think about risk and take risk.
Yeah. So part of the thing is, as Ben described, it's a mistake either to go, oh look, it's a zero risk. I know it's a sure bet. If any time that, for example, I'm meeting with an entrepreneur and they tell me this is a sure bet, I feel that they haven't really thought about it carefully, because there's in fact risk in it, and there's risk in industries and companies and careers. And then the other one is where you say, well, okay, since you can't control risk, you just roll the dice, and and the chips fall how they may, and that's what it is. Actually, there's ways to attack risk, and there's ways to take intelligent risk in terms of what you're doing. And actually, it was I think part of the work that I've been doing and thinking of this has actually become one of the 6 core values for LinkedIn, is how do you take intelligent risk in terms of how you drive initiatives from within the company. And part of that is beginning to understand that not all risk is the same, right? So one of the things we talk about is there's mortal risk and not mortal risk. Mortal risk is something where if it goes badly, it's really, really painful, right, in some way. It doesn't necessarily have to be death. That's obviously quite painful. But it could be something where it's like, I now have to move back in with my parents, or those kinds of risk. And in mortal risk, what you do is you put in a huge amount of energy. You take it as rarely as you can. You put in a huge amount of energy to make sure that it goes well, because it's a highly adverse situation. However, many other times there are risks that are not mortal, that are actually good to take, that can give you a competitive edge. One of the ones that we describe in the book that I did personally was I started at Apple Computer in the user experience group, doing kind of user interface designs, and I pretty quickly realized I should be in product management. And it was very difficult to figure out how to get in product management. So ultimately what it is, I walked over to James Isaacs, who is the director of product management there. And I said, look, I'd like to, I think this is what I should be doing, and I'd like to do this. Could I actually kind of draft some product plans that are ideas for things that we could be doing for Apple Computer's eWorld? And if you like them, could we then have a group session on them? Because then it'll be ways that I start meeting the other product managers, they begin collaborating, I learn some things and so forth. And he said, sure. Because like, all right, you show me things. Now, I was taking risks, not just the time, but like, say, for example, I showed him something that was like, okay, you clearly don't have what it takes, thanks anyway, right? There's ways that that had, risk components to it that were real. However, because of doing that, and because putting in a lot of extra work to doing that, and taking that risk of both approaching him, having him agree, doing the work, taking the group's time as a function of that.
You had a day job.
Yes.
This was all on the side.
Because another risk
All
was
night and weekend work.
are you not doing your job, right? As a portion of doing this, like did you get the user interface designs to the group? And that's an example of taking an intelligent risk. Because what you want to do is you want to look at, because one of the key areas, back to the very first concept we were saying is competition, frequently a great way to get a competitive edge is that you're willing to take a risk that someone else isn't, because you realize how to take that intelligently and how to manage it in terms of what you're doing. And so literally almost anything that's really interesting to do, any bold move has some risk to it, and so figuring out how to shape that risk intelligently is key.
Okay, so a few things to add and amplify. I mean, I think the volunteer for extra work at your job is the single easiest, best risk that almost anyone can take. If there's work going on elsewhere in the company that interests you, try to sit in that meeting, try to help out in some way, offer your time for free, do it on nights and weekends. But it's a very easy thing that everyone can do, I'd argue, in your day job. Now, one thing Reid said fairly quickly that I just want to come back to because I think it's really important is the distinction between mortal and non-mortal. And it may strike some as simplistic, right? Like that's the way you assess risk. But and I think Reid understands and has done this intuitively for so long. But one of the things we came upon when working on the book was a study of executives in the real world about how they think about risk. And some Israeli professors surveyed a whole bunch of business execs and asked, how do you think about risk when making decisions in business? And I think that the assumption from a lot of the researchers was that these really smart executives would have risk models and spreadsheets and calculate expected probabilities and consequences and really think about risk in the way that Wall Street thinks about risk, which is something that can be broken down into a million component parts. In fact, they realized that they discovered that the business execs think about risk in the way that Silicon Valley thinks about risk, which is, look, I'm moving so quickly, I have such limited information, there's so much uncertainty, I can't fill in every variable and assess a situation by plugging stuff into a spreadsheet. I have to move quick. And so the thing I think about is whether if the worst case scenario happens, can I survive it? Is the worst case survivable or not? If it's survivable, I'm going to be open to taking the risk. Doesn't mean I take it automatically, but I'm going to go with my instinct. I'm going to try to fill in some blanks and then move. Right? If I feel like the worst case scenario is my company goes under, I go bankrupt, my reputation's destroyed, then I'm really wary of that risk. And so that binary question is actually, I think, how many people, when operating in conditions of uncertainty with limited information, is how people go about assessing risk.
Exactly.
Our company is Innovative Psychiatric Solutions, and we're taking partial hospitalization and telemed and putting it basically in rural, rural areas. And really, but our goal is to do way more than that. That's just kind of our beginning point. My problem is, here, okay. Okay. My problem is that I was a therapist, not a business person, and so now my company is growing faster than me. And I'm keenly aware that there is a little window of opportunity to be a pioneer in this field, and at the same time, I don't have the knowledge I need to lead my own company to be bigger. I can lead it now, but not on a bigger scale. And so on the risk standpoint, I'm constantly weighing in my mind, which one do I slow down on? Is it a higher risk to not grow when I know that it's a train that the world's on, that somebody will get there before me? Or do I take the risk of not being the best leader I could be and figuring it out as I go? Or do I stop and get that under control first and then grow? Which is the bigger risk?
Well, it depends a lot on the specific market circumstances. I don't know, like what do the exact competitive circumstances look like? Is someone
There's
likely
hardly
to
any competition.
Yeah, well, if you don't have much competition, then you can take more time, right?
Okay.
So it's kind of a question of does the market opportunity get foreclosed, right?
Okay.
And if it does, then you have to take the risk to make sure it doesn't get foreclosed. If you actually have some time, then you can say, well, I can slow down a little bit. I can make sure that it's could I grow to being could I acquire the skills that I necessarily to scale up myself, or could I find someone to partner with me? One of the things we frequently do in Silicon Valley is a whole when do you hire a CEO? We wrote an essay on that. When do you hire a COO? These sorts of things as way of doing it. And it comes down to kind of where, which are the mortal risks, right?
Right, exactly.
And then you.
Which one's going to hurt me in the future? That's what I want to know.
And so most often comes down to, in this case, it sounds like if you don't have any near competition, and you don't have, for example, go out of business because of finance or anything else, then it's like, all right, well, we can be a little bit more deliberate in scale.
Okay.
Any other risk questions?
I'll take one from the internet. This comes from Cleo, who says, how do you deal with risk when you're not sure or unable to know what the market reality is? For example, if it is a totally new domain.
Well, that's more often for entrepreneurship. That's more often true than not, because very rarely is it a pure substitution. Sometimes it happens that way. The key thing, and this gets to other parts of the risk. One is, okay, we talked about market intelligence. Using networks in order to do that, getting as much perspective as you can. The other thing is you also frequently think about two other questions. One is, okay, if this is true, what other things would be true that I could go observe, right? So, for example, if you said, all right, do I think that people will have public professional identities? Well, are actually people going and putting up websites already with public professional identities? Are they comfortable doing that already? And if they weren't already a group of people doing that, then okay, maybe this LinkedIn concept won't work out so well as an instance. So you go and look at other things that aren't your exact product, aren't that, but are tells for, is there a demand here? Is there participation? Is there a psychological mindset? Now, frequently the challenge there is there's some, but is there enough? Is it a big enough scale as function? And then the last one is cheap shot. Try to test it with cheap shots on goal, right? Which is do something small and see if that gives you any more data. All right, as a function. Now, the smallest thing is to go talk to someone smart, right? And that's part of the reason you do that, because a lot of kind of very quick, like, okay, what do you think about this? What do you think about this? But those are and then ultimately bringing that corpus together into a decision is one of the things that makes entrepreneurship hard.
And I think it's a fascinating concept, the question of kind of what litmus tests can you construct in order to figure out an answer to a question that can't be addressed head on, right? Like often if you ask, like the most unreliable question in the world, I think, as an entrepreneur, is to ask a prospective customer, like show them a quick demo or prototype and say, would you buy this? Right? Like that actually is not very useful or reliable feedback, because the customer may say yes or may say no, doesn't really know, it doesn't actually translate into real market feedback. So when demoing something, when showing a prototype, you're actually looking for other signals, body language, the types of questions they ask to truly gauge the level of interest. It's rare, I think, on a lot of hard questions that you get the answer by asking directly, by asking head on. And so I think this is a broad life concept. In fact, I have a friend of mine, his ultimate litmus test to determine like someone's character is how they treat a waiter at a restaurant, right? You're not gonna get necessarily insight into the question of someone's character by asking them directly, hey, talk to me about your ethical intuitions. But by observing other behavioral dynamics, you can often conclude really valuable things about that person. I'd argue the same is true in a business context. We've talked so far about 3 key strategies for navigating a career landscape that's vastly different than the ones our parents had. We've talked about how to build a competitive advantage by assessing your assets, aspirations, market realities. We've talked about the importance of building networks, to a virtual team, a company around you, in a sense, that can help you get farther faster. We've talked about taking intelligent risk, as all things that entrepreneurs do that we can all do in our careers. So those are some of the skills and strategies that entrepreneurs employ. There's also, though, and I want to finish with by talking about the overarching mindset, the approach to life that entrepreneurs have when building a new business, that I think we can all apply to our own lives. And the approach is something that we call permanent beta. And beta obviously is a term that comes from the software industry that has long meant a piece of software or a product that's not quite ready for prime time. software that has bugs, work in progress, maybe unfinished. But about a decade ago, or 7 or 8 years ago, I think Google forced us all to think more reflectively about what the word beta means when they shipped Gmail as a fully functional email product, but kept the label beta at the top of the site. And I remember when Gmail first came out, and there are all sorts of blog posts about what does this mean? Is this product not work? Are there bugs? Is the spam thing not going to work? Like, I'm using a product here that's in beta. What is this supposed to mean? But as people soon found out, actually Gmail was fully functional. Millions of emails were processed. Millions of people signed up. But Google wanted to keep it in beta for a very extended period of time to signal, I think, internally and externally that the product wasn't finished, that there was still work to do, that there are always going to be bugs to work out, and that if they considered it finished, that's when a competitor will lapse them, right? I think for entrepreneurs, for Google then, and for entrepreneurs everywhere, finished is its own F word. Right? If they think of something as totally done and shipped to market on to the next thing, that product will soon be antiquated. And so since Gmail was in beta, there's a whole slew of Web 2.0 companies that launched in beta and stayed in beta for a very long time and kind of created this idea of permanent beta. They're always works in progress. I think if you look at a lot of tremendous entrepreneurs, they really think about their companies, but also their lives in this sense. And we cite in the book the annual shareholder letter from Jeff Bezos, which ends every year by saying at Amazon.com, it's always day one, which I think is another expression of the idea of permanent beta. No matter the successes we've had in the year prior, it's day one again at Amazon. Because the moment we begin to dwell too much on our successes in the past is the moment a competitor will surpass us. So permanent beta, I think, is a foundational entrepreneurial approach.
And the key things for thinking about this as regards you is that you always need to be investing in yourself. The world is changing. You need to adapt. Right, because part of being in permanent beta is like there are things that I need to do in order to continue to evolve and adapt and fit what's going on with the industry, what's going on in the company, what's going on if I'm an entrepreneur with my company. And so part of the reason why we kind of coined a term here in terms of permanent beta was to really get people to focus on always be evolving and adapting. And these are all techniques, whether it's figuring out how to adapt in terms of competitive edge, how to be kind of evolving your connections with your network, how to be taking intelligent risk in order to try to get to the next step. All of these are essentially ways to think of yourself as in permanent beta and to be evolving and adapting. And so that was the reason why we were pretty choiceful when we tried to coin terms, and this was one of the ones that actually made it into the book.
And one of the greatest entrepreneurs of all time, Benjamin Franklin, co-founder of one of the greatest entrepreneurial projects of all time, wrote in his autobiography that he used to wake up in the morning, get out of bed, take off his pajamas, put on his clothes, and then ask himself the question, will I go to bed tonight smarter than I am right now? It's a pretty intense question to ask yourself every morning. Will I go to bed tonight smarter than I am right now? And I think that is such a permanent beta approach, and he exemplifies all these ideas better than anyone. And I think I don't think this is actually a default approach by most people. There's this professor of entrepreneurship at UC Davis who we quote in the book who said, for many people, when they list on their resume or LinkedIn profile 20 years of marketing experience, what they really mean is they've had 1 year of marketing experience repeated 20 times. Right? Most people actually don't every year live in permanent beta and reinvent themselves every single year, but we argue that's what we all need to do to remain competitive.
And entrepreneurs must do. So I think we have time for a couple questions.
All right.
Yeah, is that the conclusion of your guys' slides? Hey, before we take questions, give that a round of applause. That's serious. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you. Now, I'm looking at the questions pouring in. I know Kenneth's got them. Why don't you guys queue up some here on the internet? One in particular that you mentioned, and we didn't get a chance to go deep on, about that sort of physical interaction part. Like, how about those guys and gals going like, hey, I'm a networker. There's that sort of smarmy feel that we get that we don't like. And can you talk a little bit about like how you transcend that but still get to connect in a way that's meaningful?
Well, the key thing is to actually have a good social context for it. So that's part of the reason why referral, part of the reason getting introduced to people is always better than, like, for example, when I go to an event and want to meet someone, even though there's a bunch of press around me, I never walk up and say, "Hi, I'm Reid Hoffman. I want to talk to you." I actually look for someone to introduce you, because that person who introduced you says, "Oh, Reid, he's a good guy. Just wants to chat with you about this, etc." That's useful all the time, right?
Absolutely.
As a function. The next thing is, as Ben amplified, is always being attentive to what you can bring to the relationship, how you can help. And so, for example, one of the amplifications I think we did in the book was to say, like, because this particular page was directed at college kids, was actually, in fact, when you go try to talk to someone like me or someone else, like, well, okay, what's going on in college currently? What are the big trends?
Right.
You have a unique experience here that I don't have. That could actually be useful. And so, and everyone thinking about that for themselves in terms of how do they build that connection. And the last thing is to be really careful about what you're doing doesn't just sound like an ask.
Right.
Right. Like,
I
I'd
get
really
the
like this
same
from you,
thing.
please. And you're like, okay, thanks.
You've never met. Here's an email that's this long of what you can do for me.
Yes.
Terrible approach.
Yes.
What do you guys think? One of the things that I believe in is introducing other people. If say I wanted to get to know you, and I have another friend that I think is equal social status and influence and interest.
Or interest.
Yeah,
Yes.
interest. Yeah, I threw that in there. Interest.
Yeah.
And connecting the two of you as sort of a gift. Like, I know you, I know you. I think you guys would, at some point when you cross paths, do you find that valuable?
You have to do it intelligently and directly.
Yes.
But it's another thing that fits in the theory of small gifts.
Got it.
Because if I know someone to be really, basically the model that I use when I introduce two people is I expect the two people, not expect as in expect, but I'm modeling, I hope, that both people would thank me for the introduction.
Yeah, at the end of the day, they say,
Yeah,
wow, thanks.
that was cool,
I
thanks.
took a bunch of value out of that.
You should ask for permission.
Yes.
Ideally, it's double opt-in.
Yes.
Yeah.
You ask first, hey, will you be open to meeting Reid? Reid, are you open to meeting Chase?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Now I'll do the introduction.
Yeah, that's a great tip. That's a great tip. And one of the things I want to do is also, given the sort of LinkedIn connection, that we would go to LinkedIn, because I know there's a bunch of questions coming in there. So, Kenna, can you bring us one from LinkedIn?
Absolutely, which I think is so fun to connect these
Yeah, that's
platforms
great.
here.
Here we are being
live.
networkers, right?
That's right. All right.
Living in a networked world.
That's right.
So, if you didn't know. So this is a question from Eric S., who is the VP of Operations at Colorado Technical University. And his question is, I would like to know how Reid could see LinkedIn changing how prospective students select a college or university in the future. Specifically, could prospective college students use LinkedIn to help shape their selection of which college to attend, and if so, how?
There's a group working on this exact problem.
Nice.
And part of the thing would be to bring, essentially, part of what LinkedIn does is it makes the network and ability to have it more actionable, more information, more clear, more transparent. And so the kinds of things are, all right, where you can find out, for example, what do people generally from this college graduate to go do? What kinds of skill sets are there? Are there alumni that I can go find and talk to about what the experience was when I was there? And all of this stuff is actually, by the way, largely doable now. We're building a bunch of products to make it better and easier. But you can answer all these questions. And there's some products underway that are specifically oriented towards the, like, okay, I want to make a college decision. How do I leverage my network and the LinkedIn network of information in order to make that decision?
Fabulous, thank you. And I just want to build upon that because we have Blatz who asked this earlier, but he is in high school and is a high school entrepreneur and is wondering what advice do you have for high school entrepreneurs, because we receive very little attention recognition, and that would be the same people there who are looking for colleges.
Well, there's a lot of good, there's a National Foundation for Teaching Entrepreneurship, there's an organization called Build, there's a number of organizations that focus on high school entrepreneurs. It's awesome and cool. Usually, all the same things that apply to entrepreneurs later in life apply to high school entrepreneurs, with the exception of you kind of have to get through high school as a function. And so, you kind of look at market opportunities, you look at what you can scale to do. Matter of fact, actually, I'm going to pass this question to Ben in part, given that.
Yeah, so I started my first company in high school. The thing that actually is very true is that there are a lot of young people starting companies. And so the thing that I regret not doing was finding my age-similar peers. There are I get emails all the time from people who are in their teens starting companies, so you're not alone. Find other people who are doing the thing you're doing and make them part of your network. Certainly find mentors and stuff, that's really important. But find other people who are in high school, other people who are in college trying to start a business. Talk to them about how they're dealing with things. That can be super, super valuable.
Great.
How about into the live studio audience here? Let's make sure you guys have a microphone. We got a question in the front row here. Tell us who you are and what do you want to ask these guys?
Thanks, guys. I really appreciate all the advice, specifically with networking. I'm Neil David. I'm a lifestyle photographer based here in San Francisco, and kind of have goals and aspirations someday, of, Chase, co-founded something like this, with the photography, creative background. So, like, the sky's the limit pretty much for everyone. And, like, a lot of the stories you're sharing are, they seem of this wonderful outlier greatness, looking back. So when folks are starting out, when they're kind of at that like garage band stage of growing a business or starting an idea.
In the garage or using GarageBand.
Yeah, either way, right? Really kind of like bootstrapping, completely hustling a business. What are some of the top like sage advice kind of things, or even a short story of, some of your experience of what to really focus on, and, nailing, going through learning from others' mistakes to, not necessarily fast track and skip steps, but, move through things in a really efficient way and starting out?
Well, one key difference is if you're going to do a financing and a venture route or a not financing. If it's financing, then part of the advice that I give entrepreneurs is that each time you do a round of financing to be thinking about the next round of financing. Because what you're trying to do is you're trying to essentially make the next round of financing possible, preferably at higher valuations, because that's an indication of progress. And you frequently thinking about that as island hopping, because without that, you basically die or get into serious trouble. Now, so that's on the kind of the investment side of it, and that's one of the real key things to think about is kind of what's my investment thesis, what card will I turn over, what do I then prove that make me have a broader range of investors willing to put in more money at the next juncture, and then to manage the relationships and process and everything else in order to do that. If you're not doing an investment-oriented business, but it's like, for example, it's kind of a lot of small businesses, and it's then I think the key question usually comes down to is how do you, where are you getting the best possible data on accelerating customers? Right. Usually the biggest problems in terms of businesses is what does your customer flow look like, and are you figuring out how to get a broader stable of customers, how to acquire them in better quality, more numbers, et cetera, and in an efficient way. Because if you don't solve that problem, that's part of where the mortal risk comes in as a function. And so to keep coming back to that, no matter what else you're solving in the business, is key. I don't know if there's
and on the hustle point, in the opportunities chapter, which we didn't talk about today, it's basically an idea that careers don't work as a series of jobs. Remarkable careers are punctuated by breakout opportunities. A couple key opportunities usually dramatically accelerate someone's progress. We have a section on hustle, because it is such an entrepreneurial idea. We profile the founders of Pandora, which have just this like unbelievably heroic story of, going bankrupt 500 times, getting sued 1 million times. Profile the founders of Airbnb, who Reid's worked closely with as an investor, who've had to reinvent themselves and survived multiple near-death experiences.
selling Obama O's cereal in order to make bills, pay the bills.
Selling cereal to finance the business. And I think to me, and we kind of just include the stories on the premise that sometimes the best way to get inspired to hustle or do more with less is just to hear the stories, to interact with people who have that, and kind of through osmosis absorb that instinct. And when I was first reading the Pandora story, it made me reflect, gosh, if that guy can survive all of those hardships, I certainly should be able to survive. Or if he can go through all that, the least I can do is get through this one obstacle. And so I do think kind of routine exposure, and preferably relationships with people that are hustling, no matter their field, can be really, really inspiring for your own journey.
Yeah, stay garage. That's one of the things that we like to do here at Creative Live, is we want to feel like we're always in the permanent beta, where you're always sort of keeping everything as lean as possible with your eye on the prize of trying to make this thing the best, add as much value as you can. That's the way we think of it. There's a couple other questions. I'd say we got time for maybe one more. Let's go all the way to the back, and we need to get you a mic. That gentleman standing there in the gray shirt, you look like you got something real smart to ask right here.
No pressure.
No pressure.
Yeah, my name is Cody Candy. I'm a product manager for Intuit. My question for you is now that you are a big shot investor and are kind of on the other side of the table, what are some of the biggest things you've realized that you wish you would have known as an entrepreneur to do things differently?
See, I told you that was a good question.
Yes. One of the key things that I tell entrepreneurs to do, and I actually only began to realize this when I started being an investor as opposed to entrepreneur, was that an investment relationship is rather like a marriage. And it's an odd marriage because it's frequently you get married after like 2 PowerPoint presentations and a dinner, right? Which is strange. And so the key thing is how to build a really good relationship fast. And one part of that goes back to what you're specifically doing in a pitch, which is one of the things I realized, literally the third pitch I heard, it was like, well, okay, this gets back to the risk thing. Tell me what the risks are and how you are trying to manage them. Because what I found was that, and this was my instincts when I was an entrepreneur too, is like, well, if I share any of these risks, then it looks like I don't have confidence or I'm weak or something else, so I'm not going to do that. Well, the problem is from the investor side, it's like either when I'm looking at an entrepreneur and who isn't presenting me risks, they either don't see there's risks, in which case they're blind, right, or foolish or something else, because there are risks in these businesses, or they're lying to me. Either of which, because they have risk, but they're just not telling it. They're not bringing out the kind of things that would be like, we're dealing with this as 2 partners looking at something to do. And so one of the things that I quickly added to my corpus of the advice that I gave to entrepreneurs is when you're talking to investors, one part of it is to identify what you think the key risks are and what you're doing about it. Because that helps build relationship and trust, where I can work with you. And for example, hopefully you're right, but you're smart about those risks, you know what you're doing about them, that builds confidence as well.
Fantastic. Great question. So I've got to wrap up. I got one question. I'm going to take a selfish little bit here. I've always been focused on content as an artist myself, and Ben as an author, probably this resonates with you. You guys have shifted and are doing a lot of content now at LinkedIn, and I know a lot of the folks out there in the internet audience they're not necessarily focused on raising venture capital. They're individual makers. They're freelancers. They're people that are trying to change So how can you talk to us a little bit about, for a second, making content as an individual? Is that a gift? Is that one of those small gifts that you can give out into the world? Or how does that tie into your strategy at LinkedIn?
Well, there's what individuals should do, there's what LinkedIn is doing.
Yep.
So what individuals do, if you have an ability to create content that then shapes part of the corpus of your identity, that can be very valuable in the network world, because that allows people to find you and to understand you and go, oh, this is maybe somebody that I want to do business with, somebody I want to hire, somebody I want to follow in terms of what they're doing. And so part of what we've been doing at LinkedIn has been realizing that to have business-focused content with people who aren't journalists, but who are actually practitioners, who have solved these problems, who are solving these problems, to share that information and insight, both in how they solve the problems and also the industry, so that we as business people can actually solve those problems faster. And that's we have this program called LinkedIn Influencers. We have a bunch of other things going on in order to do that. And part of that is because in this kind of accelerating competitive world, the new world of work, it's really, really critical to find to solve the problems faster, and the right information and the right people help you do that.
Great. Anything to add to that, Ben? The guy said it all, right? Awesome. Well, please join me in giving a huge round of applause to these guys. Thank you guys so much. Much gratitude. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.